Evening. I'm Amy Irvin, your host and moderator for today's Author Talk, offered by Creative Community League, an initiative utilizing cultural strategies for movement building, supporting artists, storytelling, and other dynamic community involvement, and moving reproductive and sexual awareness into creative spaces. See our website for more information, and particularly take a look at the Take Action page that has the guide to abortion in Louisiana, and it will also include a recording of this interview. The Author Talk series hosts local authors and academics writing about issues important to women and families in Louisiana and the Gulf South. Past guests include poet Anne Babson, Dr. Maeve Wallace, and Dr. Karissa Haugeberg, both of Tulane University. Today, I'm honored to welcome Robin Marty, Director of Operations for West Alabama Women's Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. She is also the author of a new handbook for a Post-Roe America and The End of Roe v. Wade. Her work can be found on NBC, Time Magazine, Cosmopolitan, Politico, and Rolling Stone, among others. So welcome and thank you for joining us here at Blue Cypress Books.
Thank you for having me and also for making me sound so impressive. I'm like, I can beat her.
Well, we've heard you on NPR and other outlets, and you are considered an expert. And certainly want to talk to you about what it's like to be running and operating a clinic in Alabama. But first, a little bit of background. According to the Guttmacher Institute, 26 states have or are expected to restrict abortion following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, which overturned the constitutional right to abortion. As a result, an estimated 40 million people will live in a state without an abortion provider. Abortion is now illegal across large swaths of the Midwest and South, including Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Most recently, an Arizona judge ruled that a near total abortion ban dating back to 1864 must be enforced, just one day before the start of a 15-week ban that passed the Arizona legislature. The first edition of your book, Handbook to a Post-Roe America, was published in 2018. In it, you laid out several likely scenarios for further restricting abortion, including the overturning of Roe. What was your reaction when the Dobbs decision was leaked, and then to the final decision by the court?
The leak itself was probably the most devastating part. I would actually say that it was worse emotionally than the day of the decision, because at least with the decision, we knew it was coming. It was still awful, especially because of the fact that we thought that we still had one more week. We actually just wanted one more day in order to be able to get through the patients that were waiting through their waiting period, but we did not get that. But the leak itself happened in the evening, and it was a moment in which my phone started going off with text after text after text. And I saw it, and immediately my phone started ringing, and the first thing that happened was that my staff started calling me, and they said, does that mean that we can't work anymore? Does that mean that abortion is illegal? And I had to explain that this was not the actual ruling that had come down. It was just somebody saying this is what's going to happen. But that confusion that we had just from my staff, who are very attuned to what's going on, was replicated over and over and over again when it came to all the patients that we had who are already scheduled, or all the people who are going to be calling us looking for help. Because at that point, Texas had been without real abortion services for 7 months, I think. Mississippi was inundated with people primarily from Louisiana. Louisiana was inundated with people from Texas. We were seeing everyone. And part of the reason for that is the fact that we were able to set up a system where, while we did have a 48-hour waiting period, and that waiting period was supposed to include 2 visits to the doctor in person, we were able to make do with a workaround that was approved by the Department of Health, where we only had to get the informed consent materials to the patient. So for people in Louisiana and others who are traveling a great deal, they would call, we would send via 2-day mail a packet that had the informed consent materials, and when they received it, they would sign the packet. They would send us an email with a picture of that signed packet, and that was able to start their 48-hour wait. And so for them, many of whom, it would take them 2 days to travel just to get to us. And the fact that we were operating and were the only clinic that was operating 5 days a week, we were seeing such a flood of patients. And then to have them all think that abortion had suddenly become illegal, some of them already on their way, it was devastating.
I'm sure it was much like it was here in Louisiana, where patients were calling unsure whether abortion was legal, illegal, whether they could get an appointment. And here in Louisiana, that continued even past the official ruling when we secured a TRO.
Yeah, and honestly, I find that Louisiana's situation was so much more complicated. If there was, I mean, I always try to find bright sides and silver linings and everything, and at least for us, everything was clear. And I'm going to be completely honest right now. Every time I hear a state like get back access, there's a part of me that gets really angry, because we can't, it's not going to happen in Alabama. Alabama has too many layers. Alabama has its pre-Roe ban. Alabama has its total abortion ban. Alabama has a amendment to their state constitution that says that the state is required to protect life from the moment of conception. It's the only state that has this and is enforcing it. And Alabama has an attorney general that has decided that everything that he wants to do supersedes any sort of federal law or restriction or any sort of motion that can be done. So for us, it was done at that exact moment. There was no fix. There was no going back. There was no, well, maybe this can happen, or maybe we can expand it at least another week or two. But for Louisiana, although you kept getting access back and then losing it again and then getting it back and then losing it again, your situation was so very different, because like so many of the clinics in the South, you did not have dedicated providers. And because of that, it was an effort of trying to have a doctor come back in order to work on those days that suddenly now the clinic was open again, trying to navigate those extra waiting periods. Most of the doctors in Louisiana, I believe, were flying in at that point.
Actually, no, the doctors here in Louisiana are local.
Oh, they are?
They
Okay.
are. However,
I thought the
there
one was not.
there was a scheduling issue for at least the doctor working in New Orleans and Baton Rouge. So that was an issue.
Yeah, I think in
these two,
Shreveport it was
possible
difficult to have a doctor come in. And what people don't understand is that when we talk about prior to the Dobbs decision and the way that abortion access worked in the South, it wasn't just the number of clinics that were impacting things. It was the fact that so few doctors actually lived in their neighborhoods. And so there were so many doctors who, for instance, in Montgomery, where we had another clinic, well, not we, where Alabama had another clinic, the clinic was only doing abortions once a week, and there was a rotation of 4 different doctors, and everybody would come in once a month.
Yeah.
And those doctors who were coming in would then, after they did their Montgomery day, go to other clinics in the South. So essentially, by sharing the same doctors, it wasn't really expanding the access the way that people thought that there was access, because there were so few days that clinics could actually operate.
Yeah, we've talked on this podcast, but also on the weekly radio program Pro Frequency, about the difficulty of identifying, training up doctors, that there is a real lack of pipeline for trained physicians. Getting back to the ruling, were you all surprised at the breadth of Justice Thomason's opinion? How likely is the Supreme Court to rule on contraception or LGBTQ rights?
I do not know if the Supreme Court is going to rule directly on them. I can tell you that in many cases, I believe it's already a lost cause in Alabama. Again, as I said, the Attorney General seems to believe that he has the ability to opt out of anything that the state chooses to do. The latest example is the fact that there's been the announcement about the Veterans Administration being allowed to do very limited abortions in very few cases, and only for people who are veterans and family members of veterans. And even in that instance, the Attorney General has stated that he does not care what the federal government says. He will arrest anyone who does that. And that is a moment in which we know that there is a federal government, and the state cannot tell the federal government that they cannot implement their laws in that state. So Alabama has gone rogue. Alabama has gone rogue because the Attorney General has also said that they are going to implement this idea of conspiracy, so that if a person leaves the state and obtains a legal abortion in another state, anyone who helps them do that is committing a crime because it was a crime to have an abortion in Alabama. And so that decimates the idea of the Interstate Commerce Clause, and that's a thing that we are going to have to see get fought down the road. So we believe that there is going to be a bill that will come up in the next legislature that will, at the very least, ban emergency contraception, possibly all contraception. And we believe that if that does go into effect, which it will, that it doesn't matter whether the Supreme Court says yes or no on it, Alabama will force it anyway.
And as we saw with the abortion bills and many of the trans rights bills and LGBTQ legislation, these bills are passed across state lines among the anti-groups, and so it's really possible we see some laws here in Louisiana being introduced in the next legislative session. You also wrote that the real goal of the conservative right is to abolish abortion altogether by creating and ratifying an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that declares life begins at conception, essentially granting personhood to fetuses, a tactic that has been used in previous states. Mississippi comes to mind several years ago, maybe almost a decade. We've already begun to see further movement to the right on the federal level, haven't we?
And there was actually language that was in the decision that was written by Scalia that actually does reference the idea that personhood is established at the moment of conception. So it's already out there in federal law. It's already codified in that decision. And so that's just opening up the opportunity for the right to begin to write the legislation to it, because now that precedent is there. And so once legislation is heard, then they're going to say this is the precedent, because apparently now precedent is the thing that matters because it's their precedent.
Right, exactly. And of course, Lindsey Graham's federal 15-week abortion ban is a play right out of the state playbook.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I mean, we're seeing some people say that maybe it's not that awful of a bill, the idea that, okay, a 15-week ban, obviously people should have able to access abortion before that. All of these things should be able to occur. And I will be honest, if there was ever, and to be clear, there's not, a place where it would be a 15-week ban for all states, that would be something that I would be willing to at least consider as an option, primarily because but he's not talking about a 15-week ban for all of the states. He's talking about a 15-week ban for all the states that will allow abortion. Expanded beyond that, and for any state that wants to make it restricted before that, that's still fine. And so it's this lack of consistency that really drives it all apart.
So the trigger bans and other laws that prohibit abortion in a state like Louisiana would still be on the books. The federal 15-week ban would impact California, or New York, or Illinois.
Yeah, and at this point, I believe South Carolina is the closest space. South Carolina and Southern Illinois are the closest spaces that a person in New Orleans can go to in order to get an abortion after the first trimester. And that's a devastating impact on any person who needs that, because we already know that clinics are filled for 3-4 weeks in all of the border areas as it is. And we are going to see, and already are seeing, people get pushed later and later into gestation in order to access what should be their legal rights.
Mm-hmm. You touched upon this earlier, but prior to Dobbs, what was a typical day like for you at West Alabama Women's Center?
So prior to Dobbs, we were seeing roughly 300 patients a month, which for us was a pretty dramatic increase from 200 patients a month, which is what we were doing prior. West Alabama Women's Center, because it was open 5 days a week, was responsible for roughly 50% of the abortions that occurred in the state of Alabama. We would have patients on most days come in, and if they were having procedural abortions, they would come in early in the morning. They would do their procedures, and then we would do first day appointments for new patients so that they can start their 48-hour waiting period. In the afternoon, we would then have patients who would come in for medication abortion, and so we would be able to do that in larger groups. That was what a typical day was like, But then we would have days where things just really escalated. And one really good example is the fact that for the week that ended up being the week that Roe was overturned, we did not have our provider in state because she had a family emergency. And as such, I was forced to go try to find a backup doctor who could come in. That was, as we discussed before, extraordinarily difficult to do. And I managed to find one doctor who was able to come in for just one day. And so as we were planning for this week and knowing that we were at any moment Roe would be overturned and that we would be stuck, we set it up so that on the day that he was coming, which happened to be the day before the decision, we had 75 patients come in and do medication abortion. And we set it up like we had we're not a large clinic, and we had this very streamlined system where, first of all, obviously we didn't see anybody for anything else, and then we would have groups come in at different periods of time, and they would check in outside, and then they would get paperwork and move to this lobby, and then when they were done, they would move to the counseling room, and the new group would come in, and we just kept rotating them through the clinic until everybody was through and came out. And I'm so very grateful for the fact that happened, because then the next morning the abortion was gone. And we already were dealing with about 100 patients who had appointments that were not going to be able to fulfill their appointments. If we had not gotten that group through, it would have been almost 200.
And so you can imagine the scenario outside of clinics in states where it's legal at the moment. I mean, as you said, there's already long 2 to 3 week waiting periods to get an appointment. I recently attended a forum hosted by the Abortion Care Network, a members-based association of independent providers. It really is shocking how devastated the network of independent providers is. And we should note that, prior to dogs, the vast majority of abortions in the United States were provided by independent providers, not Planned Parenthood.
And that is especially relevant in the South, where almost all of the abortions were provided in independent clinics, and the Planned Parenthood exists, which there are fewer of them in the South than there are in the rest of the nation. They did not provide abortions. And in fact, in the state of Alabama, we had 3 independent clinics and 2 Planned Parenthoods. The Planned Parenthood did occasionally provide abortion, although we weren't always sure when. But there was a period in April where all of a sudden we realized that we were getting a number of additional patients, and they were telling us that they had booked appointments with Planned Parenthood, and Planned Parenthood had just called them and told them that they were no longer doing abortions. Because Planned Parenthood stopped doing abortions in the Gulf area 2 months before the actual decision. And so we took in those people, and that was part of our increase.
Mm-hmm. And Planned Parenthood here in New Orleans has never offered abortion care, although they had built a beautiful building that I saw and applied for their license. But of course, the state never granted that license. So
and that's a thing that I myself worry about quite a bit. And I know that a lot of people, especially in the movement, but also in the independent provider movement, are thinking about is the fact that if there is some sort of wave election that happens, if there is some sort of federal thing that can finally be put into place that would give us back even medication abortion, even the tiniest bits of abortion access again, we've lost all of our clinics for the most part down in this area. They're gone. They closed. They moved. There are
and per Louisiana law, if you're not providing abortions on a regular basis, you automatically lose your license. And so there is no grace period. I mean, so
is that
or,
allowed? Are they able to still keep their licenses as reproductive health providers if they're doing other services? Or I'm sorry, that's probably like way too elite for you.
Well, neither of the 2 clinics I'm most affiliated with were really providing additional care. Was primary abortion.
Yeah, and that's what is happening in our clinic as well. Is 95% of what we were doing was abortion. We pivoted obviously because Alabama was completely without abortion care, but the reality is Alabama didn't have maternal care, did not have preventative care, did not have prenatal care. All of these other aspects were missing as well. So we moved to those because we knew that in the state of Alabama, the only place that a person can get free or reduced cost contraception is through a county health department, because the state of Alabama holds all Title X funding and will only release it through there. So patients were coming into us before saying that they were waiting 3-4 months in order to get an appointment, and that was not something that was ever going to prevent abortions, that's for sure. So we tried to step in order to fill that gap, because there's so much.
Mm-hmm. So what additional services are you offering post-Roe?
At this point, we are offering contraceptive coverage. We are doing a layaway IUD plan, which is really fun. So we are providing IUDs for $150, and then people can pay $50 a month in order to pay off the rest of it, but they don't. We're doing good. That's what matters to us. One of our bigger services right now is PrEP. We're doing telemed PrEP, primarily with clients from TKO Society, which is a Black trans organization in Alabama. We're hoping that we can expand that, as well as our other annual exams and things like that. But probably the most important thing that we're doing right now, in our opinion, is the fact that we are doing a pregnancy confirmation for people, because Alabama has not expanded Medicaid. The governor has said that she will not expand Medicaid because it's still too expensive. But you can slightly higher income level be eligible for Medicaid if you are pregnant. But the only way that you can become eligible is if you have a doctor's proof of pregnancy, and of course, without insurance, no doctor will see you. So people are being trapped in a cycle where they are not able to get any form of insurance. But then also, once they do have insurance, a lot of them are unable to get in because doctors won't see Medicaid patients. So we're doing a lot of prenatal care, and at this point, although we can't do any deliveries, we are seeing patients who they were pregnant long before this happened, and they are second trimester, third trimester, and we're the first doctor they've ever seen in their pregnancy.
I know that several of the independent providers are also moving towards providing trans health.
Yes, and that is something that we're doing. We now do gender-affirming healthcare. The danger of that is obviously that the more of this sort of healthcare that we are providing, the more that we are just as much of a target as we were when we were doing abortion, because all of these things are things that the government does not want us to be doing. And so we know that when the next legislative session happens, there is a possibility that some sort of new licensing or something can happen that will go in order to close our clinic, even if we don't get in charge with conspiracy or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So we're treading water.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even safe states like Pennsylvania are impacted. And you've sort of talked about this, but can you give sort of a broader view of the fragility of abortion care in the U.S., especially across the South?
It's super bad. Is that evocative enough? It's really bad. And the problem is that we are looking at it under the wrong framework. We're looking at it as bodily autonomy, which is true. But what we need to be looking at it as is a healthcare crisis. It is a healthcare crisis to force somebody to give birth if they do not want to give birth, because every moment in childbirth could potentially end up in that person's death. So nobody should be risking their lives if they do not wish to do that when there is another medical intervention that is far less life-threatening. That's a way that we should look at it, but also we need to address abortion and pregnancy continuation in the realm of the fact that we already are in an impoverished section of the United States that has no access to healthcare. It does not have access to hospitals. It does not have access to doctors. And so if you look at your abortion stats for 2021, which I looked at before I got here, there have been 7,444 abortions allegedly in 2021. Assuming that some of those people do leave out of state, that is still going to leave at least 5,000 people who are going to need a hospital. They're either going to need a hospital because they're having a miscarriage, they're going to need a hospital to give birth, they may need a hospital more than one time, because we know that people who have not had the chance to plan their pregnancy have far more risky, life-threatening pregnancies. So how is your hospital system going to take on this additional load? And if it's anything like what we're seeing in Alabama, it's not going to, because we are seeing patients who have pregnancies, wanted or not, that are suffering with bleeding and go into our local hospital and don't get seen. And it's not to have anything to do with abortion laws. It's because we have a medical system that does not see pregnancy as something that is a medical emergency. And so we could deal with the person who's miscarrying, but that could take a couple of days anyway, and this guy's got a broken arm, and that needs to be splinted up right away before it heals wrong.
Well, we are in a fortunate position that Medicaid was expanded in Louisiana. However, the vast majority of births that occur in the state are, those folks are receiving Medicaid assistance. There's been, a recent law passed where it sort of extends the amount of time that.
Okay, the part care.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's helpful. But of course, as you're saying, we can expect more complicated births and difficulty in getting pregnancy, postpartum issues that are going to occur that will need healthcare.
And one of the things that really concerns me about Louisiana especially is because I did go through and look at your maternal mortality rates, and that one of the biggest impact on them is preeclampsia. And preeclampsia is something that is only cured when a person is no longer pregnant. That is the only way that you can end it. And so here you have a state that has not defined what life-threatening care looks like. And so at what point does preeclampsia become bad enough that it merits a termination? And so we know that when a person has preeclampsia with one pregnancy, they're likely to have it more severely and earlier with the next pregnancy. These are people who are going to die for lack of having any sort of guideline over when they can end their pregnancy without threatening their life.
Yeah, and that's been widely reported in news, in which the ways that hospitals are assisting and not assisting women receiving that care in the clinic setting, in the hospital setting. I want to get back to your own situation there in Tuscaloosa. In a recent Rewire article, you expressed the possibility of the clinic closing because of a lack of revenue.
Yep. I think about it every moment.
And the other physicians and clinic owners in the article, I believe it was another physician that working in Arizona and a physician working in Cleveland, a preterm, had similar concerns and worries. You've mentioned some of the challenges of just keeping the doors open and providing services, but what are the challenges in keeping the clinic open long term?
It's really difficult. When we headed into, and this is one place where actually the leave was really beneficial because it gave me enough time to be able to address how much money we were going to need in order to continue operating, to move forward on our plans to do that contraception while we still had money, things like that. And so we had about enough money that I knew we had 3 months, and we should have run out of money in October. But we have been able to fundraise through that period, and we are now to a point where I have enough money to get us until January. That's still not very far, and it's not very far when we talk about the fact that at this point we are now applying for private insurance. If we can get private insurance, that changes everything because we have a population that is very insured over at the university, and we know that they will come to us for healthcare services. That will give us the cushion also to be able to continue our free and no cost services that we're doing right now. But insurance can take, you never know how long it's going to take to get credentialed for insurance. Medicaid, getting credentialed for Medicaid in Alabama usually takes 6 to 8 weeks. It took us 2 years. We do not know if that's going to happen with these other insurers. And once you get that in place, then you still have to go through the entire process of submitting your claims, waiting for it all to come back. So right now, I'm just doing everything I can to fundraise until we get to a point where we have that income that's coming in. And it's very frustrating to know, first of all, that this doesn't have to be that way. There is no reason why all of the resources should be thrown in states that are receiving. And it is so important for clinics like ours to stay open, not just because of the fact that there is no access to birth control and prenatal care and everything else, but the fact that there is a assumption that every person, if you give them enough money, can leave the state in order to take an abortion. And that's completely not true. There are too many logistical reasons that make it impossible no matter how much money you give them. And so there will be people who are going to end up doing their own abortions. And that can be very safe, but also can be very confusing. But we also know that this is the community that is the most most surveilled and the most likely to end up in jail if they go to a hospital. So these clinics could still exist and be a safe place for people to come for aftercare if somebody wanted to fund that network, and nobody does.
Right. And as you mentioned earlier, some 7,000 abortions were provided in Louisiana this year. There's no way that they're going to be able to fund everyone's transport to the nearest abortion clinic, which is several states away, hundreds of miles away. I think in the Rebar article you mentioned that following Dobbs, you raised about $180,000. Yes. But you also indicated that donations are drying up. And also you're concerned about donors. So have donors written off the South, as you suggested in the article?
I think donors have written off the South, but also our donations, for the most part, have primarily always been, especially that $180,000, was literally grassroots donors. It was people who said, because it immediately came in because we were looking for funds to help move people out to Atlanta. And so that was more than enough, obviously, to do that. That was a crisis that people understood and recognized, and also it fed into the idea of getting people out of state. And there's something about the idea of actively helping abortion in that way. It's the reason why we saw the clinic that was moving from North Dakota to Minnesota raise $1 million in their GoFundMe. But when the clinics that were down here were raising money in order to give severance to their employees, nothing happened, because nobody wants to support the basic. They don't want to support the cleaning up the mess. They just want to do the active fun is a loose term. We are getting people to care, and a lot of it has to do, obviously, with inherent racism. Has to do with, we still have a very eugenic mindset when it comes to reproductive rights, and so there are so many donors that we've seen who want to support abortion but don't want to support helping somebody who is parenting. That's a very real thing that happens and continues to happen, and it's so unfortunate.
Well, one of the questions I've been asking guests is, how likely is it that you're going to be able to work across the aisle with Republican Louisiana legislators to get these sort of safety net policies in place? I mean, if that were their real concern, the state would be, not at the bottom of every list. But...
Well, and in Alabama, the legislature has already released what their priorities are for this post-Roe landscape, and their priorities are not obviously expanding Medicaid by any means. They are going to focus on more training for foster families and subsidizing people who are going to be doing adoption. And so that in itself is a very clear indicator that the goal is to have more people give birth and then take away their babies.
It's horrible. And of course, more funding for crisis pregnancy centers, which have never been bastions of truth.
Well, and that's going to continue even more
passion,
because that's going to happen at a federal level, because we saw the bill that Marco Rubio put out that is supposed to be a compassionate bill that is really just a way to send a bunch of money to religious institutions.
Exactly. Can you talk a little about the importance of the Yellowhammer Fund and abortion funds more generally?
Yeah, so Yellowhammer Fund was really on the ground when it came to the 2019 ban, and was able to use both the political clout and the media clout, and especially the financial clout that they received, to basically build an infrastructure in the state. That was probably one of the things that has kept Alabama going. It was what organized the groups in Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery all together in order to make some sort of change. What change looks like in Alabama in comparison to what change looks like in other states may be really minute, but it's still important. It was work that got our sex ed curriculum to stop saying that if you are gay, it's going to kill you. That was a bill that went through legislature 5 years before it passed. It was the work that made the trans minor health care bill fail the first 2 times that it went through, although it did get through the last time. And in some ways, that's because everybody lost their resources down here because they stopped funding things down here. So what we need people to understand is that abortion funds aren't just about funding abortions. They're about building networks and mutual aid, but also political clout among organizations in their region. And that's why it's so devastating to see that everybody is saying, there's no point in giving money to funds that are in red states because we could just give it to the blue states and they're moving the red state people out there so they can do it that way. But what they're doing is they're deconstructing what network we have been able to build as allies in order to try to fight this sort of action. And it's another way that I say that I feel like the national movement has given up on this out.
Mm-hmm. Well, as the co-founder of the New Orleans Abortion Fund, I always thought of it more as a movement-building organization as I did a direct service organization. Although, as a fund, we did a lot of that work. But it was as much about finding our people, supporting coalitions, being in the state house, giving voice to people that had never told an abortion story, or all those things that are important.
Is that foundations look at numerics, and so they're like, I'm going to give you X amount of dollars, and if you can show them we helped this many patients, then that is okay, you did good. Whereas if you say we built this organizational structure, then it's not something that they can visibly count and see and write off as okay, you have made success. That's one of the really big issues also with the way that on a national level we're funding abortion work, because we are finding that donors are really putting money into either electoral support or into this idea of social change. And so it's being a bunch of foundations that are like, well, if this race is one, then that's how we prove that money was spent. Or if there are this many media hits over this event, then that proves that the money has been spent. But everything else, there's no actual way to tally it off, and so they aren't interested in it.
Well, I've said many times over the years that few people understand what organizing is, community organizing is, and that applies to some funders as well.
That applies to most funders.
Following dogs, and years before, actually, I began to encourage folks to assess their personal tolerance for risk around ensuring abortion access. You addressed risk in the chapter about civil disobedience, a tactic employed by suffragists, civil rights leaders, Black Lives Matter activists, and presently women in Iran. What were the conversations with your friends and family when you decided to relocate to Alabama to work at an abortion clinic?
So, I spoke with my husband. It had been a while in the works, and we had put it on hold because of COVID. When we ended up moving to Alabama, there was in the house. The children had never been left the state for the most part. But I did it with the understanding. I told him that we had 2 years, and then I was clearly wrong. So that's coming back to bite me, and he's not going to let me forget that. But we had always spoken about the idea of legal risk under the same guidelines that I put in the book, which is assess your risk by, are you the only person who can take care of your family? Are you the only person who is able to do the thing that could potentially put you in jail? Are you the only person who is going to take over your responsibilities once you are in prison? And so for us, this was a work that I could do where I didn't. It was legally safe at that moment, and that was important because I am the parent and he is the parent of 3 children, and so that I was both as a freelancer, the primary caregiver, and I had a lot of responsibility in the family, and so I couldn't just take off and be arrested. But how things change based on your own life situation, but also the situation around you and what other people's risk tolerance are. And so for us right now, we are at readiness line where we know that the Attorney General has made it very clear that he wants to come after the clinic for the idea of conspiracy. It has silenced a lot of the work that we could be doing, especially around helping people who are potentially miscarrying, whether that is a miscarriage that is natural or induced. And that can't continue. And so we needed to look at what our clinic is doing, and then who in the clinic is able to take the most tolerance for risk. And in this case, that's me, because my doctor cannot, because my doctor will lose her license, and that is a long-term impact far beyond any sort of legal trial. My staff is mostly Black single moms. They are not able to risk anything because they are the sole breadwinners of their family. So it would come to me to be able to take any sort of legal risk. And so that's how we analyze what is something that you should be doing. Are you the only person who can take that risk? Are you the person who can best take it upon yourself? And can you use your privilege in order to make that happen? And for me, I am the height of privilege at this point. I have a husband who works at home. He can hopefully take care of the children. We'll see. This week didn't go so great, but maybe later. So that's what we have to look at, because if we don't test what they are going to do, like, we know that the First Amendment should be protecting our freedom of speech and should allow us to be able to provide information regardless of what they say. We know that interstate commerce means that we should be able to send people across the state and they should be fine. We know all these things, but we also know that this is a legal system that is no longer following the rules, and so we need to test the system. And we know that when we test the system, it may come back to bite us. But if it doesn't, then we open up a new avenue of things that we can do, and then we can make the next test.
Well, what security issues did you consider writing and promoting the book?
So I have a lawyer. That's nice. That was actually something that my agent wrote into my contract, was a legal retainer for the book in case something happened. Unfortunately, that's just for the book. So that's if I get in trouble for the book. So anything that I might be saying that might be illegal, that's because I wrote this book. It has nothing to do with the clinic. Thank you. But also not saying anything illegal, I'm pretty sure. But we're getting into this point where, especially the last South Carolina bill had language on there that said that it was a felony to provide information about how to do an abortion. So that is a point in which my book becomes illegal. So that is something that I had to think about. But also, I'm going to be completely honest, back in 2018, I didn't really believe it. Like, that's kind of a lark. And now, I mean, Mississippi passed a bill twice, or tried to pass a bill twice, that did the same sort of felony legal language, and it failed each time. And you're like, well, if it fails in Mississippi, then surely it's never going to go anywhere. But clearly, it's starting to move, and so that's a whole other calculus now. I have always protected my own security by being very out there. And so for me, it's mostly about protecting other people. So I was very vocal about things that I was doing in order to protect my doctor, so that she didn't have to worry about anything coming at her. At the clinic, I would be the one who was dealing with protesters so that nobody else had to. It was understood, like, I'm very out in my neighborhood at home because they know what I do, and so maybe they don't all agree with it, but they do agree that nobody should be harassing me, especially because that would affect them. They don't like that. So being out is a way of protecting oneself.
Any good union organizer knows the more out you are and vocal about your support of a union campaign, the safer you are, generally, from an employer. We know folks will continue to seek abortion care, even in states where it's illegal. There's been documented cases of women being jailed while abortion was legal, even with Harvey Patel and others. What measures should people take to ensure their privacy and safety on social media?
There are a number of things, and I am a huge fan of Kate Merchant, who has her Twitter handle, don't do crimes online. Because, I mean, literally, just be logical about it. We spend a lot of time in spaces, Reddit spaces, Facebook spaces, where people are talking about trying to obtain abortion. And so there are things that can be done, such as there are burner accounts that people can do if they're going to ask questions on Reddit. There are anonymous accounts that can be done when you do it on Facebook. But also the reality is that these are social media organisms that are going to still be keeping a record of everything, and that record could come back to haunt you. But while we can look at all of these ways that a person should protect themselves online, things like if you're going to use a period tracker, use Yuki, because Yuki does not store data in our cloud, things like that. What it comes down to is that every person who has ever been arrested has been either turned in by when they were seeking medical care and turned in by their hospitals, or somebody that they knew tipped off the police. And so you can be careful online, you can all of these things, but if you tell your best friend who tells your brother, then that's how you're going to get arrested, and they will find a way to make things stick. But I also want to be really clear that we're talking about people who have gone to jail either before Roe, but I want to put on the radar the fact that Alabama, at least, is working on imprisoning people just because they are pregnant. And so we have apparently had instances, which we didn't know about until National Advocates of Pregnant Women released the information, that there were 5 women who had been detained indefinitely, pregnant postpartum, because they had been caught pregnant and doing drugs. And so these women were imprisoned and they were allowed bail. They were not allowed out of jail until they could find a space in a rehab center that would take them in. And they were not able to do that because, first of all, there were no spaces. And secondly, their drug addiction was not at a level that made rehab something that was eligible for them. So effectively, the state of Alabama has set a precedent for interning people who are pregnant in order to protect the fetus. And that is something that is going to continue and that is going to end up in other states. And it terrifies me, and it should terrify everybody. And that's shit we need to go and protest right at the jail cell.
Well, certainly it's a concern given that we're living in Louisiana, the most incarcerated place in the world. And in part why so much of this information has gone sort of underground, quiet. From my point of view,
Louisiana is the first state that tried to say, okay, you can go ahead and jail the person who was seeking out the abortion. And that may have gone away in the last legislative session, but it's coming back in the next one. And will it pass? I'm not sure.
Right. So I think that might be a good place to be. I'm not sure we could talk for hours and hours. I guess perhaps I would just encourage people, if you haven't registered to vote, to do that. There's some important races coming up. But also, I want to leave it open to questions from the audience, or if there's someone joining us online that has a question.
I'm just curious about the role of midwives and how they interact. I worked here in Louisiana with both my kids with midwives post Katrina, and I was surprised to find that a lot of laws were less restrictive in Louisiana than they are in other states. They're more like entrenched medical industrial, But I had a situation where I couldn't take out my IUD because I couldn't afford it, and my insurance wasn't paying for it, so I couldn't replace it, but I couldn't take it out. And the woman who I birthed my baby with had seen me post a question on Facebook and was like, I'm coming over. And not only did she remove it, she gave me another IUD. So
So midwives are in a really particular situation right now because of the fact that they are always going to be suspect. They are going to be scrutinized far more than any other medical professional because they have access to medications necessary in order to help a person in pregnancy. And also because of the home birth aspect of it and the hospitalized aspect of it, there is a potential that a person could have an unsuccessful birthing experience, and that would also be criminalized. I am terrified for midwives at this moment because they are really, in a lot of ways, more legally vulnerable than any doctors or anyone else. And this harkens back to the fact that prior to the whole industrial medicalization of it, and of course the way that it was moved institutionally, but also moved patriarchally, midwives were the ones who were providing all of the care, and this was done. Regulations existed the entirety of abortion restrictions that happened in the 1800s all grew out of the fact that it was an attempt to move childbirth and any other sort of reproductive health care away from midwives. And so it is not surprising that in the same way that we are seeing essentially the Comstock laws back, in that it's in the 1800s it was illegal to provide information about any sort of advertising of birth control, contraception, abortion. That was considered obscenity. And so that only ended because of Roosevelt v. Connecticut and the legality of birth control for married couples. So it's not surprising that we're going back to this idea of criminalizing speech as obscene in the same period that we are going to have midwives be highly scrutinized for all of their work, because it goes back to the fact that most of the governors, including the Louisiana governor, nobody is explaining what a medical emergency is when it comes to justifying doing an abortion. And that's because the powers that be want the discretion to be able to decide on each individual case. And I can tell you that if there is an incident with a particularly male physician who is having an unsuccessful live birth event and a midwife who is doing that somewhere else, I can see which one's going to end up being arrested.
And of course, there's a chapter, there are several pages in your book about the history of midwives and the importance of midwives and doulas, and talk a little bit about abortion doulas.
And did I don't remember my book anymore. Oh my gosh.
But certainly folks may be turning to using an abortion doula if they're managing a self-managed abortion.
And that is something that is going to end up in a lot of, that's going to be another one of those really big testing things, because for instance, if a person who is in Alabama reaches out to an abortion doula, or maybe reaches out to an abortion hotline, like M&A, miscarriage and abortion hotline, and has somebody assist them just by answering questions and talking through, like, is that conspiracy? And can they charge somebody who's out of the state for that conspiracy? How is that going to work? And it's the things that actually, because we know in our clinic, right, we will offer, if somebody asks, if somebody's going to call us and say, I am doing my own abortion and I'm really scared about this thing that just happened, I mean, we're not going to help them. We're going to help them because that's what you do. If somebody has an emergency, you treat their emergency. And so, again, we get back to, is this criminalized information? Is this assisting? Is this aiding and abetting? And there are no definitions right now, and that's purposeful.
Well, and we should know, you can go to the World Health Organization website and get a protocol of how to manage your own abortion.
Yeah, and instructions that explain exactly how to tell if a complication is a real complication or just part of how the medication abortion is happening. And also, just from speaking to people who've done medication abortion themselves, I think it's we don't make it understood well enough that you can be having a bad experience with your medication abortion, and that doesn't mean that you are having a complication. You are just having a bad abortion experience because miscarriage sucks. Giving birth sucks. It's painful. Like, these are not pleasant things. And no matter how much it's romanticized by the right that we are the angelic people who are Mother Madonna holding our newborn babes that somehow just pop out with halos. No. I almost died in my first childbirth. I think most people have an experience of that sort.
Well, we should note that the vast majority of Americans seeking abortion care were doing it earlier in their pregnancy, and oftentimes utilizing medication abortion, in which the protocol even used in a clinic setting is to take the first pill in the clinic and the second pill at home.
Mm-hmm. So they were always doing it on their own.
Exactly. There's a question in the back?
Yeah, so there's been some talk of potentially outlawing IUDs or newer bills, and I just don't know if you can touch on that for, birth control in general.
Yeah.
Especially with IUDs.
Yeah, it's gonna happen. Sorry to be a downer. One of the reasons why we are working so hard to get birth control, IUDs, pills, emergency contraception out to as many people as possible is because we do believe that, at least in our state, it is probably going to end up banned in the next legislative session. It should not happen that way. Luckily, there are places online that some forms of birth control can be obtained. If you go to Power to Know website, they have a list of places that, places like Choix, it's CHOIX. That is a place where you can get a lot of hormonal birth controls. Panda Health is another one, and so there will be ways to be able to get birth control unless we end up in a place just like we do where they won't send them into states just like medication abortion. One of the reasons I get very frustrated about the idea of we can fix everything if we allow over-the-counter birth control is the fact that over-the-counter birth control, for the most part, only offers you the least effective forms of birth control. And so not only is it giving you less effective options, like nobody gets to go get a box IUD and just, that's not a thing that happens. So not only does it do that, but it undermines the idea that with the Affordable Care Act, all people who have insurance get no copay birth control. And so you can get an IUD through your insurance. You can get, there's a stupid little ring that's out now that you use one ring for a year in order to prevent pregnancy. That thing costs $2,000 for 1 year. That's the out-of-pocket cost. I don't even know what the doctors charge for it. It's just what they were trying to have us pay. So birth control is a medication or a device, and it is not cheap because our medical system is a for-profit medical system that thinks that people should make money off of other people's health.
It's like going into that, what if you already have your ID?
Yeah, it's not like they can come and take it out. That would be, it's not like they could please not have just spoken that into things either. I do not believe, although maybe I will put that into my dystopian novel, I do not believe that they can come by and check you for an IUD and yank it.
So what if you have like your checkup?
I would say that likely at a checkup that is not going to happen. I would say the most likely impact would be when it was time to switch said IUD, that you would not be able to get a new one. But I do not think anybody's going to come in and literally grab this stuff out of your body.
If you think your provider would do that, I would switch provider.
Well, exactly. This is something else that I've been saying that people can do. I mean, there's so many things that we actually can be doing in this moment. And one of them is to have a conversation with your OBGYN to find out what their position is, not only on abortion, but contraception, sterilization, vasectomies. I mean, it's surprising how few people have actually had this conversation, the deeper conversation with their provider.
Especially important to find out if your provider is a provider who would turn you in if they found out that you had obtained an abortion either through a less legal channel, but also just outside of the state, because that could be something that's going to be illegal. And so you need to be aware. I mean, let's be honest, having a doctor is a privilege. Having a regular doctor is a privilege, because even for most people who have insurance, they don't get to see their same doctor over and over again. They're often put into whatever doctor in that practice happens to be available at that moment. So it's a very risky thing. You shouldn't feel like you're accessing healthcare is risky, but we are in a very dangerous moment right now, and that is really unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. I have a follow-up question on the birth control illegality thing. Do you think that if they were to make birth control illegal in a broad sense, that would also include vasectomies?
No.
So, right.
Yeah, because guys get control whether it's or not they want to. That's of course. I think that although you will find that places are not going to offer it, I think that it's not like illegal in that sense. But that's another thing that I want to make sure that people understand when it comes to the idea of birth control becoming illegal, is that we don't necessarily need a legislative bill that makes birth control illegal. The state has a number of ways to be able to cut off a person's access to birth control. Anything from, like in Alabama, where you can only get it through this county health department where somebody does IUDs once every 2 months, to the fact that you have states that, I mean, all of these pharmacies that are doing pharmaceutical refusals, and even the fact that pharmacies are choosing not to stock certain ones to start with. Doctors have discretion now, and so you could have a doctor who's totally, okay, birth control is legal, however, you aren't married, and I don't really think we should have that, because you should only be having sex in a committed relationship that has been approved by God and the law. And so it doesn't matter what the state law is if there is somebody who is gatekeepering that off from you.
Or making it cost restrictive.
Or making it cost restrictive.
I'm sorry, but I just wanted to put this out there that I was fully employed and was paying $700 a month for me and my kids towards Louisiana Blue Cross Blue Shield. and it was going to cost me $3,700 out of pocket to have my IUD removed, and another like $4,700 to have it replaced out of pocket.
And they do that because that is how the for-profit medical system works. Because I can tell you that your ID was likely about $1,600.
No, it was about the
And-
procedure.
Yeah, and so I mean, our doctor does it for $50, and that's because people deserve healthcare. I'm sorry, you've been so patient.
That's okay. And sorry for my voice. I want to ask, you know, we're in a space where people clearly know what's going on, but I know for a fact that's not true. Across a lot of states. I know the clinics are still getting calls. Well, the one that's still answering the phone.
Yeah.
From people who don't know what's going on in places where the news is now reaching them, if they read the news at all, or wherever they might get information. And when you've been talking about movement building, you've been talking about the way you foresaw it was coming. So many activists did that Amy was talking about for a long time. We're still in a place where people aren't up to the minute of the reality of now. I mean, we're talking about the future, but people don't believe it right now.
Yeah.
And people don't have access to all kinds of things that could put them in a position of even knowing what's happening. So I kind of want to ask you about that. Like, what do you do about the rural swaths across this whole area, across the Midwest, where people don't know what's going on, don't have access? How do you movement build when the actual population is so oppressed
Yeah.
that it can't access any of that?
It's so true. And that is why, like, there are communication and movement frameworks that I feel personally do not work in the South. The idea that things like liberate abortion and shout your abortion and such, that is created for an environment that the people aren't oppressed by their government every moment. For a lot of the patients that we saw, they don't think of themselves as people who have abortions. They think of themselves as people. And then abortion is just a thing that happened at that one point in their life, and then they moved on and did other things because it's really not that meaningful of a moment. They will know, okay, well, thanks to that, this did not happen, but it's not a life-changing moment. And so what we are trying to do when it comes to movement building is the idea, especially in Alabama, of really reaching out to organizations. We know that in the South especially, organizing is primarily something that is done by people who see a need. And so organizing builds from a community, from one person who usually says, I need this thing and this thing doesn't work. I'm sure that more people need this thing. I'm going to figure out how to make it happen. And one really great example of this is the new executive director of Yellowhammer Fund, Janice Fountain. She originally had an organization in Birmingham called Margins, Women Helping Black Women. And she started it when she was a single mother and needed assistance. And one of the things that she really needed was somebody to help her make food. Like, her kids were hungry. And so she was like, what if there was some sort of system where somebody would go deliver lunches to women who were stuck at home, Black women, single mothers who were stuck at home with their children. And so she started doing that, and it grew from there. That's how community building works, is here is a need that does not exist. This person, by having dealt with the systems of oppression that have caused this and found a way to work around it, is now going to share that information and work with other people to make sure they get it. And then it's building the connections in between them. And so in a lot of ways, our problem is the fact that we are trying to build this on abortion, as opposed to building the different pieces that the community has already identified as a need. So when we are working with people in Alabama, when we're working with TKO, we are working off of their work, helping them with the needs of their community, which is primarily they're serving Black trans youth. And so when we're working like as you keep seeking and building with the other people, then you can do layer upon layer of movement organizing, because the important thing is the fact that all of these oppressions are interrelated, and we all know that. They are all based in poverty, they are all based in racism, they are all based in this idea that there is a hoarding of power, a hoarding of political clout, and a hoarding of money. And this is the root of all of the things that are going wrong. We can say it's Christian theocracy and that's what's leading it. But the reality is that we have a set of people who are in power right now, who have been in power for a long time and are afraid that any change to the structure is going to endanger their power. And that's on our side as much as it is on their side. It's lawmakers who have refused to step down even though they're in their 80s and 90s. When we have lawmakers who were around before Roe and are still making the laws, and then why are we surprised that they're making laws that also want to end abortion because they grew up in a time where there was an abortion? Like, the fact that we are not moving forward is purposeful, and so we have to find a way to break that cycle, and that's through the community and empowering the people who have not had the voice before, because those up there are never letting them be heard.
Certainly, I think organizing, movement building, moving forward is going to have to be hyper local. You mentioned, you're more likely to be turned in by your friend's boyfriend or your aunt.
Mm-hmm.
So you really need to know who is around you and your neighbors.
And we can do that on a legal scale and on all these other scales as well, because when you know the sheriff in your town, you know if that sheriff is going to be somebody who is going to do prosecutions. When you are working on your city council, you know that you can make sure that voting booths are getting to the right area so that everybody can vote and not just certain populations. And when you are working on your school boards, then you can make sure that education is actually happening, because one of the biggest tools that have been used right now is the idea of decimating schools so that people do not receive an education to be able to fight this.
And I would go on to say that we really need to be utilizing the networks that we're already a part of.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, many of, in my experience working here in New Orleans, so many of the more established organizations have run from abortion access in the past, did not want to address it, did not want to be associated much with the issue. And yet I think that is now everyone's responsibility to be discussing this and having those conversations.
And again, it goes back to the idea that abortion is not a political topic. Abortion is a life-saving procedure that helps people avoid the potential of death in childbirth.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you so much. I read your book back in 2018. I used to teach at Tulane. I signed it over and over again. I told all my students, you need to get it. Because I think publishing something that is such a resource guide, that is like no nonsense, that kind of information is powerful, and it makes people feel empowered and powerful to have that and have access to that. So that's just a personal note to thank you.
Just to go off of that was the real reason that I wrote it, was just the fact that every person was like, oh God, what do I do now? And the information in that book is not for everyone. Like nobody should be doing everything in that book, except maybe me. Especially when I start growing and being the next Jane. But what it is you need to feel like you can do something in this moment. So here are 10 chapters. I guarantee you that there's one thing in there that you can do in order to feel like you are really tapped in and can make a change. And if everybody can do one thing, then that is going to change our movement.
And even just to tell people where to find information that might not be in the book. If you're looking for this, there are these sites. If you're in Alabama, these are the organizations. Like, it's just, anyway, so thank you for that. My question, though, because I wasn't sure how much time we had left, is you mentioned offhand near the beginning that you try to see the bright side. And I just wanted to know, in this grim moment, I try to take a long view. Nothing is forever. Things are going to change. What that looks like is like where we have power and vision and an ability to act. For you, do you see silver linings? What are those? What does that look like for you as you engage in this work on the front lines?
Yeah, I firmly believe right now that they went too hard too fast. I think that this is going to come back to bite them. If there had been exceptions allowed, if it had been more things like heartbeat bans and not total bans, I think if they had just not been so extreme all at one moment, that it would have been something that people would have done, just like unfortunately we always do in the US, which is, oh, that's really bad, and also I just got used to it really fast. This is really bad and nobody's getting used to it. And it is only getting worse as more clinics are closing, more clinics are backing up. The thing that sucks so much is the fact that this is on purpose. There is a reason we are not being given resources. There's a reason we are not getting anything that could minimize harm. And that's because we have a national movement that knows that the more of a disaster this is, the more of a headline this is, the more everybody goes, holy shit, how did this happen? The faster they're going to get a federal law. And that's what they're banking on. And the South especially is the collateral damage that is going to cause that to happen. And so it's in their best interest not to help us. And that's horrifying, but frankly true. And so as we move forward, this is going to be such a bad period. And I'm really hoping that everybody can do everything they can to protect themselves physically, protect themselves legally, protect themselves emotionally. But I believe that if we can weather the next year or two, I think that this is going to reverse. And I think it is going to reverse much faster than it would have originally had they not bitten off so much. So that's the part that gets me over. I'm going to say something that's really controversial, because all the rest of the stuff that I've been saying was not. I hate being a parent. I hope my kids are watching. I do not like being a parent, and from the most of the time in which I have been parenting, I have been doing this thing where I'm like, okay, so one more year and they can get to school, and then I'll get some time back. Or, okay, like right now I'm at 8 years and they're all out of the house and hopefully to college, or just out of the house because I've told them they have to leave at 18 regardless. So I always tell myself, okay, I can get through this next year, or this is going to happen in 2 years and it will be okay. So right now I'm telling myself, I think this is going to be a completely different landscape in 2 years. My hope is that we have a federal law. If we don't have a federal law, I do firmly believe that people will be so pissed off and ready to do something that we are going to have people just doing it regardless. And they can't arrest everyone. And that's an important thing to remember. There was a protest in, I want to say, it was one of the Koreas, and I always get my Koreas mixed up, and it's really embarrassing. So I'm just going to say a Korea and leave it at that, where 100 women got together in the streets and all took a pill. And 2 of those women had mifepristone, and the rest of them all had who knows what. And the police did not arrest anybody because they could not figure out who were the ones that did the abortion and who were the ones who did not. That is the kind of stuff that is going to happen. In the same way that people are always asking me, you know, why don't people just do illegal abortions? And I mean, for a doctor, that's a huge risk. But the reality is any person can be an illegal abortion provider. Any person is able to go to a website like aidaccess.org, obtain medication, hold on to that medication, and if somebody that they know desperately needs an abortion and can't get anywhere, they can safely, securely give that person that medication. That puts them at legal risk. Is that a legal risk that that person feels safe in doing? That is something that each one of them has to decide. But what we know is that any person can be an illegal abortion provider. The thing is, the right also knows that any person can be an illegal abortion provider, and so we know all of the different people who are more likely to be surveilled, more likely to be incarcerated, and all of that. So those go back into the checks and balances that you put in as to what sort of action you're willing to take.
One more.
I think you made a Jane reference
I
a second
did.
ago or a minute ago.
I Janed all over the
Do
place.
you think that that is something that we're going to see, like a new Jane type network? As
There-
you're talking about risk calculation.
Yeah, there are Janes already. The fact that we don't know them and where they are and such is a sign that the work is happening in the right way. But one of the things that I try to emphasize is that this is so much of a better medical situation than pre-Roe, because medication abortion is primarily easy to access, even in states where it is illegal, and medication abortion is so very safe. It is not okay to take away a person's right to be able to obtain a procedural abortion. Every person should, in all honesty, be able to access whatever type of abortion feels the best for them. There are reasons why people would not want to do medication abortion. When I myself had a miscarriage, I was offered medication abortion or DNC, and I took the DNC because I did not want to labor and go through that. But the reality is that just like 20% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage, medication abortion is inducing a miscarriage, and it's inducing a miscarriage at whatever point a person takes that medication abortion. So be it super early, it is known that medication abortion can be used later, and that as long as a person keeps doing more misoprostol as they go, that eventually there will be contractions and that will swell the fetus. So this is basically every pregnancy is going to end in a delivery, as it is, whether it's a miscarriage, whether it's a full-term delivery when a person is prepared to give birth and wants to give birth. It's all going to be the same, and yet with medication abortion, it is so much less risky than a full-term birth. So we know that this is a really good option for a person who is willing to go through that, because it is so much safer than anything else could be, and definitely far safer than childbirth. And so, I mean, people are going to decide to do other forms of abortion, and aspiration abortion is really safe as well, but it requires training. And there is menstrual extraction, which can be done very early. But these are also all things where no person can do it on their own. You cannot give yourself a menstrual extraction or a vacuum aspiration. You can do a medication abortion on your own. And so to have that tool is a wonderful thing in this moment in time.
There's a lengthy chapter in the book about this. And again, I'll direct people, if you're needing more information, the World Health Organization has a lot of information there for you. And I think with that, we will end this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure and very informative talking.